The Dershow.
This Trump case is such a disaster, this attempt to try to prevent Trump from campaigning. The only purpose of bringing this trial, there's no crime. There's no crime. It's a made-up case. There's a misdemeanor, failing or misstating payments on a corporate form. The statute of limitations on that expired years ago. In order to create a felony out of it and bring it within the statute of limitations, they have to allege that the reason that he paid hush money was to influence the election. That was the only reason. It wasn't to try to prevent his wife from being embarrassed or his children from being embarrassed. No, that played no role at all, because according to the former head of the Federal Election Commission, in order to bring a federal election case, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the only purpose was to impact the election. He gave a few examples. If somebody is going to be on television and buys a $2,000 suit, which he's never bought before, in order to help his election prospects, that's not an election contribution because he has the suit. The only purpose is to try to keep him out of Pennsylvania. Biden's in Pennsylvania in the next few days. Trump should be in Pennsylvania. There should be an election and a campaign from both sides, not from one side. And the judge completely misunderstands the Constitution. The Constitution gives the defendant the right to be at the trial. It doesn't give the state the right to compel him to be at the trial. He can waive the right to be at the trial, and it's been done over and over and over again. Defendants have waived the right to be at the trial. There's a famous case some years ago, way back, during the Jim Crow era, where the defendant was a black man who was accused of raping a white woman. And the defense attorney very cleverly got permission from the judge to keep the defendant out of the courtroom so that the jury wouldn't know that he was black. Because if the jury didn't know if he was black, they're not going to convict a white, he was 19 or 20 years old, they're not going to convict an 18 or 19-year-old white guy who had sex with a 17-year-old white girl of statutory rape. But if the defendant were black, of course they would. And so in order to prevent a racial verdict, the defendant waived his right to be at trial, and the court granted it, and he was acquitted. A defendant doesn't have to be in the courtroom. He has to be there for sentencing, obviously. He has to be there for the verdict, but he doesn't have to be there for the whole trial. And to make him be there for the trial is unconstitutional when he has a First Amendment right to be out there campaigning to be the president of the United States. You know, as I've said before, I have a constitutional right to vote against him for the third time, and a constitutional right to see that this is a fair election, and that if he loses fair and square, without the thumb, or in this case, the elbow of Democratic politician prosecutors on the scale of justice. And so he has the right not to be there. And I hope his lawyers will bring a case. They could get it up to the Supreme Court pretty quickly, I think, saying that if the defendant wants to miss the trial, he can. I mean, he wants to go to his son's graduation. He wants to go to the Supreme Court to listen to the argument as to whether he has immunity. No, we're not going to let you do that. The judge has it on backwards. If they try to keep him out of the courtroom, that would be a violation of his constitutional right. But if he decides to waive his constitutional right, in general, the Constitution permits him to do so. Now, maybe there's some New York regulation or New York rule which requires him to be there. That's unconstitutional. If it denies him his First Amendment right to be out campaigning for president. So I hope his lawyers will raise that issue. It's the worst, weakest case I've seen in 60 years of teaching, writing, practicing criminal law, and yet it might result in a conviction because of the judge in the case, because of the jurors in the case, and because of the prosecution in the case. What a scandal.